till 1990 was under a dictatorship. So have you all heard of Augusto Pinochet? Or Pinochet? We'll go into a bit of information about that, but I guess Chile wasn't alone in that regard. Several surrounding neighbouring countries were also under the sway of military juntas, also long-enduring authoritarian regimes. I can think of Argentina, obviously, which I briefly mentioned in reference to Las Madres de la Plaza de Mayo just before. And I can also think of Brazil, which from the 60s until the mid-80s was, and some of you that watched the podcast where the students talked about Tropicalia knows that musical movement sprung out of kind of countercultural tendencies against that dictatorship. So Chile wasn't alone in the 70s in that regard. There were multiple dictatorships, but we'll start with Chile because it's under the conditions of dictatorship that so-called free market reforms were first rolled out anywhere in the world. And, there's this assumption that neoliberal economics results in greater social freedoms, and yet the first time that it's put to test is actually through majorly reduced social freedoms and an apparatus of repression, Literally, the coup that resulted in the overturning of the democratically elected government of Salvador Allende, who was a socialist president, elected in majority with his National Unity Party in the beginning of the 1970s, was overthrown through the sponsorship, the support of the CIA and its counterinsurgency activities. So it didn't just happen. There were definitely areas of discontent against the government, but it was aided and abetted and financed and militarized as well between a rebel element within the armed forces, which formed a junta under Pinochet, General Pinochet, and attacked the presidential palace and basically killed the president, right? And so that brought in something like 17 years of rule by a military government, and that established the constitution that so much has been contended over recently in Chile. The Chilean instance also reveals a lot about how we understand social memory across generations, because obviously the condition of living under a dictatorship, especially in the first 5 years of Pinochet's regime, was one of constant imprisonment, kidnapping of so-called subversives, and the use of sports stadiums as basically concentration camps. So they were very dire years. And here in Australia, we had a lot of people seeking asylum in the early under Whitlam's government and then Fraser's government. If you know anything about Australian history, that's when humanitarian passage was first opened up in Australian immigration policy, disestablishing the White Australia policy and allowing for the settlement of peoples from Indochina, specifically Vietnam, but also from Chile. So it's connected to our part of the world. But today we want to also address, in that long durée, between dictatorship Chile, the turn to democracy, post-1990, the transition to democracy, what happens with activism? What happens during the dictatorship where it's really, really hard to oppose a regime, which you would know from Lucia's lectures as well, in the case of Egypt, for example, but also what the opening to democracy makes possible? Does it result in a rise of supposed freedoms of expression and organising, or does it entail a downturn? Does it create new circumstances in which that gets funneled through institutional politics, formal politics, or does it create a kind of distancing? So there's a few things nestled in there. But I think chief amongst them is to understand two strands of social movements in Chile, and that is to say the student movement and the Mapuche movement. The Mapuches have their ancestral territory south in the southern part of Chile, and that wasn't actually colonized until well into the 1800s. So they were not brought under the sway of European power. Instead, Chile was already formed as a nation state, and then there was this military campaign to try to conquer their territory, basically over the last 150 years. And so their living memory of their attachment to their territory, what is Mapu, their land, which is not just Chile, it's also Argentina across the border, is a very important part of why they want to continue to protect the country, and why you cannot divide their political identity from territory. So it's important to contemplate the histories of both struggles, but also in more recent times, since we're going to be talking about movements in movement and opening or not of political opportunities, we need to consider what's known as the October outbreak. And I really wish I had some documentary material to pass around right here. Someone actually gifted me with this photographic book of everything that happened in October 2019. I have some images I can show you, of course. But it's incredibly moving as a document because it shows a lot of conflagration and obviously destruction as well, but also the ability of masses of people to come together to make a major turn within the political conjuncture, which is really very Latin American, I have to say. But Chile offers particular tonalities on that because of its history of struggle before that point. And so we can't sort of separate periods off as if this so-called social outbreak was spontaneous, but instead understand what it had inherited, what was brought new into the panorama, particularly given the distancing from formal politics, which we really see occurring from the opening to democracy and then onward, the institutionalization of the main parties, and people's discontent with the sort of stranglehold politically, and all the pressures. There are various pressure points which are made use of through the student movement. So very young people had been involved in politics from the get-go. We've talked a little bit about Pinochet's regime, here you can see a cavalcade of Pinochet and the junta, proudly sort of getting about in a car, having just overthrown the democratically elected government of Salvador Allende. If we want to talk about periodization and also the different presidencies that erupted post-dictatorship in the transition to democracy, where a plebiscite was actually held. Because imagine, it's 1989, By this time, Augusto Pinochet is getting pretty old, and the whole regime is ossifying. There were some cracks in the regime, and especially on a global scale, people exposed a lot more of what had been going on, and there's pressures on that regime. But it was put to a plebiscite. Shall we continue under this model? Of course, for the Pinochetistas, it was a success, right? Because Chile had become strong economically, supposedly in national growth, and also become very securitized, which for those on the right is tough on crime, providing oasis for capital, and so on. Or should we vote no because we want social freedoms? We don't want one-party rule. We want change. Can you imagine what the majority of Chileans said after 17 years? Yes or no? There's even a film about the failure of the No campaign. People voted resoundingly to end Pinochet's regime. And a broad centre-left coalition of a range of parties then began to occupy that space. And that's why it's called a transition period, right? So an attempt to come back to a consensus, multi-party, between the Christian Democrats, Socialists, Social Democracy Party, and the Humanist Party, and the Greens. We see the rise of presidents such as Patricio Aylwin, Eduardo Frei, Ricardo Lagos, and then in two periods actually Michelle Bachelet, who was a forerunner in terms of women presidents in the region. There's actually a number in Latin America, including in the present day in Mexico. Claudia Sheinbaum, and we will talk about her in a couple of weeks a bit as well. So you can see in the alternancy period, in that transition from 1990 until 2010, it was basically the coalition multi-party state that was in place, the Concertación, as they were known. This was actually dissolved in 2013, and we see the rise of our first kind of multi-millionaire president, Sebastián Piñera, and his centre-right National Renewal Party. So they gained power kind of 20 years on from the transition to democracy period beginning. But then, because of the polarisation and pendulum swings that are so typical between two-party systems, I guess, especially with the contention between left and right, he has one term, and Michelle Bachelet comes back in power under a new majority party. Also a coalition, but not the Concertación. So, interestingly enough, Michelle Bachelet is a chief respondent on human rights now with the United Nations. So she has gone on to have quite an interesting political career. And she was both celebrated and in some ways loathed in Chile, especially by elements of the student movement, and we'll see why shortly. But Bachelet actually spent some years as a student here in Australia because her father had been persecuted by the regime. So that really informs one as a political actor, doesn't it? You can see that her particular accent on, for example, bringing together people in a coalition is very different from the polarising pro-capital, pro-multinational, pro-elite politics of the media magnate and billionaire Piñera. But because of some political earthquakes and a literal earthquake in Chile, because Chile is prone to earthquakes, there's also a return to Sebastián Piñera subsequently until and into the period of the social outbreak, which changed everything. So a wave of protests, for example, began to use his image, this bloodied image of him being basically like Pinochet in many ways, but just dressed up as this kind of executive, right? Before we get to elements of the social outbreak of October 2019 on and what that implied, we can at least track that between that outbreak and then what happened politically with the elections of March 2022, that we have a new leftist party under the helm of Gabriel Boric, who was a former student activist. Very young, 35. And this would not have happened without this October outbreak. This is what spearheaded it. It was founded in 2018 by the autonomous movement, really drawing on the autonomous tendencies within the student movement. So he, as a young person, had been active as well as a student activist. He wasn't from the main political fray, and that's really important, isn't it? If you think about the standoff between what's seen as formal politics and the institutional face of that, and how disconnected people can feel, especially when there's major income inequality in a country, and Chile is probably most exemplary for that, even though it's also been touted as, you know, on some metrics as being very democratic, right? At least before Piñera. So he swept to power, I guess, and was sworn in March 2022 and proposed to lead with the main demands of the social outbreak of 2019, which was to rewrite the constitution, because that was seen as the main problem by a range of social actors involved in the outbreak. So the first task was to draft a new constitution, and that was to be drafted by not formal political actors, from people from communities. And in the tutorial we were talking about what that looks like at a neighbourhood level as well. and it was put to a plebiscite. It was pretty radical and what some people call maximalist, like a blueprint for everything that people were demanding, but trying to do that through the constitution. But the medium didn't fit the message or vice versa, and there was a lot of politicking around that, saying it was too radical. And much like our voice to Parliament, it got voted down. Do you remember in the context of Australia when Albanese first got back, first gained government, yeah? The polls suggested that 65% of Australians supported a referendum to vote yes for the voice to Parliament, remember? And within a year that reversed. And the no campaign won. We can make comparisons, I think. What seems to be a dream document, a blueprint indeed, for real political change, then gets subject to all this scrutiny and polarisation, especially by powerful media sources, yeah? And just because you've had a social outbreak doesn't mean that those elite sectors of society somehow have less influence or disappear. So, what was the new constitution asking for? They put together a constitutional convention made up of people from community and outside of the formal political spectrum. So if we want to talk about political opportunity, they were literally jumping over those hurdles and trying to break with that stranglehold. And that stranglehold was seen to be most visible within the constitution itself. To move from a democratic republic to equal democracy in which women occupy at least 50% of all state bodies. From an indigenous omission to define Chile as a plurinational and intercultural state. Now, obviously, there are echoes of Evo Morales' Bolivia, which had been mentioned, and also Rafael Correa's Ecuador, where those changes were made in the constitutions of both countries, yeah, to declare them plurinational. And I know that Corneille's existence was also interpolated through that process as well. Yeah? Chile wanted to do something similar. Or segments of community, important social actors, including from the Mapuche movement, were really pushing for this. Actually, the whole process of constitutional redraft with this convention assembly was led by a Mapuche linguist, yeah, who's visited Australia a number of times. I can tell you a little bit about her. But yeah, from indigenous omission to define Chile as a plurinational and intercultural state, recognising 11 peoples and nations. The law that in the dictatorship constitution of 1980 protected the life of the unborn. And so this new draft proposal sought to ensure conditions for voluntary and protected pregnancy and also the voluntary interruption of pregnancy, childbirth and maternity. That is, to remove that really repressive measure to criminalise abortion. It went from previous model of dispensing with the state wherever the private sector supposedly would take over for the social good, which we know is not true in an income unequal nation like Chile, to ensuring that a social and democratic state of law would be brought into being through the constitution to provide goods and services to ensure the rights of people. And this is very important because there's so much undermining, not just during the dictatorship, but also in the multi-party transition to democracy, of people's rights to pensions, of people's rights to some basic social goods, because the blueprint of the regime's constitution went unchanged, even within the so-called democratic period. So you can see why that would cause a lot of problems. The new draft established water as an inappropriable good, because basically there were many moves afoot through the water code to be able to go into territories, yeah, and access groundwater. Territories that are supposedly given some degree of autonomy or land rights recognition in the Australian parlance for Mapuche people, wherein even though they had those holdings, the companies could be given free license over basically chopping down forests so that they could access and take water from Mapuche land. So this has been a real sticking point. to what extent is it, droughts and things like that in the country, or bushfires? Yeah, there's lots of parallels with Australia here as well. Is the result of climate change, and to what extent it's because of what is permitted through things like the Water Code that undermine people's territorial rights. Yeah, so you can see how this was kind of like the dream document for a range of actors. So water cannot be appropriated. Yeah. It eliminated the Senate and created two chambers of asymmetrical power, a Congress of Deputies for the formation of laws and a Chamber of Regions limited to laws by regional agreement, because there's like 9 different regions in Chile. It's a confederation, but there's a lot of different territories and interests. It is quite a maximalist document. As I said, it was headed up by Elisa Loncon, the Mapuche linguist. She visited and she held talks about the failure of this draft. A second draft was then proposed, but under an executive assembly, that is, excluding all social actors outside of formal politics. And it basically went the other way around. Yeah? Recriminalise abortion. It's so despairing, given the energies that for a long time were coalescing and that led to the social outbreak. How students got formed and transformed by being involved in student politics, what kinds of demands they were prepared to make on the neoliberal state, and so on. The way in which they form political knowledge about their realities. Yeah, all of these things are really important. And if we look at the October outbreak and how people organised in community and brought this process forward and got Gabriel Boric elected, it seems like moving in the right direction, right? But so many things went sideways. If we have to refer to the Chilean constitution that still exists, because the second proposal was also rejected, by the way, so we're at a real stalemate still in Chile. Let's make that bigger. If it wants to show itself. Okay, it has remained unchanged. We can say that now, because both drafts, the maximalist document that was the dream imprint for so many communities, voted down. The right-wing elite aligned one also voted down. Yeah. Basically, there's no new constitution. So that was a chief demand, right, of the popular sectors. So as such, the solid legal institutional barriers that firmly cemented the regime's neoliberal socio-economic and political vision remain in place. A stifling binomial electoral system has effectively created a two-party system, which, as we've already referenced, having looked at the Concertación and then Piñera and then Bachelet, those swings, remains the case. So we've had, under Boric, a very radical left-wing government that's now been voted out for, you guessed it, a right-wing media magnate called Jonathan Cast. Now, he basically used that word communist, left, right and centre, and also used the so-called debate about the violence or crime being caused by the presence of Venezuelans and Haitians in the country as a way to weaponise questions of borders, yeah, and blame others for things like the drug trade, problems that pre-existed the entry of refugees from places like Venezuela, yeah? So it's very problematic, but you can see that the stalemate of the Constitution is a chief reason for why things are not moving, except that they seem to go one way and then the other way, yeah? Numerous high quorum and supra-majoritarian requirements exist in this Constitution and its organic constitutional laws. It is the most positivistic document you can imagine. It's very restrictive for any kind of social change. Issues such as the education system, the electoral system, have effectively equipped a political minority with veto power. So especially with Jonathan Cast coming in power, with this constitution still in place, it's going to be hard for people to lobby with the state, right? as it was in previous instances, but perhaps even harder now. And especially when you've had 2 drafts voted down. As we know, this is an expensive process as well. It has its costs politically and economically. In Australia, it's not going to be easy to get up any other kind of referendum either, right? So this is the kind of stalemate that often emerges in 2-party systems. Finally, the predominantly conservative Constitutional Court was equipped with wide-reaching powers to preemptively strike out provisions it deemed unconstitutional. And so that makes you wonder about the sort of like 3 powers, and how much the courts can weigh in or not, like who they're directed by, or whose interests they reflect, and so on, whether they're truly separate. All right, let's talk about October outbreak, because this is the part that will get you kind of interested and excited, because it is an incredible moment, yeah? On the 6th of October, 2019, okay, just shy of the beginning of the pandemic, keep that in mind. And of course, like in other parts of the world, including in Lebanon, there were also major uprisings, yeah? So we can make some parallels. I'll just leave that there. But not 30 pesos, 30 years. What sparked it was a proposed fare hike on the subway network. This triggered massive reactions by secondary students who refused to pay for that and said, you could think it's only the equivalent of 4 Australian cents, right? But for us, and for those of us who exist in conditions of the income inequality that exists in Chile, this is substantial. We are going to refuse to pay for this. This is a corporation that's made a decision, yeah? Transport Corporation. And they took to the streets and they destroyed a lot of things, right? They jumped the turnstiles, quite literally, in massive amounts. And that's where it started. So it was mainly secondary school students that first reacted. Now, it seems like an estallido, an explosion. That's the word that's used in Spanish. There's so many ways we can think about what explosion might mean. Is it violent? Is it volatile? Is it spontaneous? Of course it wasn't completely spontaneous, but from an outsider's perspective you might think, hang on, but Chile was doing well, right? Democratically even. And I can remember a woman, an environmentalist, talking about environmental activism in Chile and saying things are so much easier now as an activist. And then this happened. And it sort of exposed a lot of the face-off between the elite, as represented by the formal party in power and their political interests, and everyday people, yeah, including students. So on the 9th, just a few days later, Sebastián Piñera, then president, declared that Chile was a true oasis with a stable democracy, favourably comparing the country to the rest of Latin America, supposedly in turmoil, right? So this is what we would call Chilean exceptionalism. This constant sort of signalling around Chile as being somehow different from the rest of Latin America, more quote-unquote first world, right? But just a few days later, these initial protests, jumping the turnstiles, smashing up the metro, turned into much huger manifestations and demonstrations, as well as confrontations and radical actions, including, yes, the destruction of property across the country. It happened really quickly, within 1 week. And I remember a really close friend of mine on Facebook had posted a picture of the CBD of Santiago, which looks really like Brisbane, I guess, but has this beautiful backdrop of the Cordillera mountain range of the Andes, snow-capped, and it just looks like really peaceful. And so he posted an image of this and said, yeah, ya me voy a Chile, I'm going back home for a bit. And then he arrived to a very different Chile than he had imagined, right? And I'll show you some images to put that contrast in perspective. So the Chilean oasis would turn out to be a complete illusion. But it is one that a lot, even Democracy House, believed in through their metrics, right? And that environmental activist I referred to. Obviously, she's a mestiza woman. She's not Mapuche. Looks very different when you're indigenous as well, in terms of what your environmentalism means. How many freedoms to be an activist you may have. Not being criminalised, not being policed, not having the counter-insurgency laws being levelled at you as a terrorist in the country, because that has happened a lot with Mapuche activists. Not necessarily with mestizo and mestiza, that is mixed race Chileans. Yeah? So the social outburst, or estallido social as it became known, or this is interesting, Chilean Spring. Yes, it took place in spring, but why do we have to keep working from other examples, right? Yes, Chileans there would have been aware of the Arab Spring. They're students, they study, just like all of us here, right? But how much this nomenclature helps, I'm not sure. One thing I will say is that when the Arab Spring, so dubbed, took off in Tahrir Square in Egypt, they quoted poetry from Pablo Neruda, who's the national poet of Chile. So we can read them sideways, in a sense. But yeah, it's just a seasonal thing. It slots in well with journalism, doesn't it? It is October, like in Australia, Chile's in the south, so it is spring. I guess it's the kind of unexplained element that people initially couldn't get their heads around. Some people, especially in global media sources and diplomacy. So this resulted in more than 20 deaths in those first weeks and thousands of wounded civilians and many more thousands being arrested. A combination of concessions, reforms and repression had thus far been unable to diffuse what became the gravest social-political crisis in the country since its return to democracy in 1990. Scholars looking at this period, of course there's been more produced since we first started to bring in the October outbreak of 2019 into the unit, started to look at the role of grievances, political attitudes, especially towards Piñera and the establishment, the rise of cultural changes in the nation. Some look at protest tactics, the relationship between mobilization and repression. And of course, these are kind of mainstays within social movement theorizing. However, less understood is how students, including university students who had been secondary students in earlier forms of protest activity, were drawing on their organisational tactics, but were not the only actors. They helped contemporary, and at that time secondary students, helped to spearhead this. But then the massive amount of other people becoming involved in mobilisations cannot account for only this form of uprising, which, while we can see connections to student activism over the turn to democracy period and on, new actors were really brought into the public squares, and to that extent it is similar to the Arab Spring, right? So the most visible demands were improvements in pensions, healthcare reform, better salaries, a new constitution. Now, this became the mainframe because it really seemed to spell out all the problems in the country, issues, obviously, that extend well beyond just the social material needs of secondary or university students. But we do need to bear in mind that because they already had organised, and in fact one of them became the president, that their lines of working collectively were still influential. So that's why it's important to still look before 2019 and not get trapped in the bubble that burst. Even though it was really surprising to many people. So what looks like an increase in public transport cost actually is just the tip of the iceberg, if you look at that graphic there. And that mentions many of the factors. Worst education in South America, very privatised, and one of the most expensive in the world. Poor condition of the Chilean healthcare system. pension system crisis, miserable salaries, precarious jobs, police gate, salaries of the political elite 33 times higher than the minimum wage. Lots of collusion going on between certain industries without actual agreements. The only country in the world where water is private. Of course, it was attempted in Bolivia, and you may have heard of the Cochabamba water war of 2000, but mass social uprisings there overturned that and basically ran the government out of town. And that's what led to the rise of Evo Morales in Bolivia. So we do have an antecedent in neighbouring Bolivia. So, yes, it's true that more formal social movement organisations played a role, but it expanded beyond that and included social media networking, alternative venues for expression, obviously, and activism, especially when you kind of want to do flash mob type things, yeah? And the evolution of a new form, the assembly form, from a community basis. And we'll be talking about that in the tutorial. So, here I've got the counterpointed images. My friend Carlos was putting photos like this up, postcard type photos of the CBD with the beautiful Cordillera, snow-capped in the background. Looks so peaceful. Yes, Piñera's oasis, that is the capital, right? But what lies beyond that? Look, in the really significant crackdowns by the police and the military, we saw scenes of repression that had not been seen since the Pinochet dictatorship. And we went from that to that within a week or so. You can imagine that for some people this was terrifying, right? And I remember speaking to quite conservative people as well on the phone, and they were saying, these are terrorists, these are communists, you know? But even that started to change because of the repression, really. And, you know, think of a populace that has lived through a dictatorship and disappearances and major human rights abuses and killings, extrajudicial killings. The previous generation would remember that. They'd be scared, of course, because it's trauma. We can't underestimate that either. But it's not the democracy that Chile had been telling the world that it was. Yeah. And so young people were very involved, right? They didn't necessarily have the knowledge of the Chile of their parents, especially those who had been in social movements, yeah? And maybe had to leave Chile and only subsequently, decades later, were able to return. But young people formed through an unequal education system that could see critically the problems going on. They were really driving this as well. People in impoverished neighborhoods, yeah? Pobladores, that's the word that's used, in so-called marginal neighborhoods. But yeah, the action of the public force, of police, the carabineros, and the military was absolutely astounding. I can say that my friend Socorro, she had people sending footage on her phone, yeah? Before blackouts and things like that, because that always happens in repression, right? They cut the comms, and that's happened in Iran recently. But honestly, there were tanks everywhere, and they were using, sulfur spray and bombs, and people went blind. People lost their eyes as well. I know this is very graphic, but if you're already very angry as a population, you know, given all the reasons in that Chilean iceberg, this doesn't result in social peace. So regardless of how you judge it politically, it significantly escalated things. Piñera said, this is war, right? Which is very interesting because then people said, this is not a war, Chile has woken up. These were some of the hashtags that began to proliferate. Chile despertó. No estamos en guerra, educamos para la paz. We're not at war, we're educating for peace. Yeah? It's not about 30 pesos, it's about 30 years of that stalemate, of the institutions of power not responding adequately to pobladores, Mapuches, estudiantes, students as well. So it's not 30 pesos, it's 30 years. And here we can see that it's not just that 4 cents, it's all of these things that got to this breaking point. High student loan debts, politicians' outrageous salaries and benefits, miserable pensions, precarious jobs, some of them I mentioned already, decades of abuse of power, extremely high social inequality. We can see this as an accumulation of injuries over time. So rather than it being a surprise, well, that would be disingenuous, right? Government authorities said they never saw it coming, but really it's about the way in which people organised, yeah? And how they analysed their situation that resulted in this increasing movement from the time of the October outbreak. The Chilean political system had become increasingly elitist and detached from society. We also had seen other factors such as rapid social change, traditional hierarchies based on gender, sexual orientation, ethnic status and age, increasingly contested, non-binary politics as well, yes, especially amongst young people. Wave of feminist protests, including through the use of performance art, very impressive. There's this great feminist group that arose at this time, just beforehand actually, called Las Tesis, and they contextualize really well through dance and through protest song and chants what violence against women is. So maybe we can look at that in the tutorial. The continued conflict between indigenous Mapuche people in southern Chile and the government, especially imprisonment and charges on terrorism that were levelled at many activists, especially the most radical. A multiplication of political symbols and emblems between the Andean Huipala flag to the Mapuche flag to LGBTQI plus visibility and pride. Looking at vision from the October outbreak and all the protests and forms of public mobilisation, you can see this. Yeah? Obviously, political scandals and corruption played a role, and weakened party politics, especially of the last administrations. The transformation of organising from below and autonomously, embodying the movements that we're considering now, can change the balance of forces, right? Clearly political change is possible, even though it looks like it isn't. And I think adjuncts of Chilean social movements demonstrate that, especially with the political stranglehold of the constitution, yeah, between social movements of students and the environmental movement and indigenous movement as well, that you can't wait for change, actually. You can't wait for an opportunity to present itself. You have to create that. That social movements have not just a constitutive power, but a destituent power, yeah, that they can dissolve power in a way, yeah? So this is a real radical rethink, isn't it, of what we'd assumed to be the game set match of political power, elections and so on. Yeah. So, in a historical review, the sociologist Rossi, who's Chilean, would tell us, let's not ignore the strategies that have been built up over time, including where things haven't been achieved, where there's been frustrations and dead ends. Yeah? People learn, and we can look at that in regard to the student movement as well. So Rossi says we're not just talking about strategies of contention, the most visible. We're talking about stock of legacies, yeah? So this might be what it takes to theorise from at least Chile, right? And repertoires of strategy, what has worked in some other contexts, right? In previous victories. All of these things, not just the accumulation of injuries, but of strategies and legacies, coalesce. Insider and outsider strategies between the more lobbying kind of form of political action to those that just refuse it because of that stranglehold, yeah? And a different vision of democracy. Refusal of institutional politics altogether. This is very pertinent for feminist activists in the country as well. The closeness and detachment thesis just relates to what networks you may or may not have with mainstream political actors and how far that gets you. And so political opportunity that's assumed to exist within democratised spaces suggests that all you have to do is line up and occupy those spaces in some way or make those links. But people learned over time that really didn't get them very far, yeah? And so that led to a lot more detachment. So, one of the main paradigms within Northern social movement theory is to talk about political opportunity or the political process model. My computer's going to turn itself off. I want us to begin to think about how we can sort of turn that around and say, no, other notions, such as those of Rossi, yeah, repertoire of strategies, stock of legacies, perhaps are more important than the waiting game, yeah? How long is a string? How long can you wait anyway, especially when those accumulation of injuries are so present in people's lives? Now, because my computer's turned itself off and we're 5 minutes to the end anyway, I think, if I'm reading properly, we might just stop there. But I want you to look at some stuff, if you haven't already, on the Penguin movement. Yeah? Now, it's so dubbed because it was school students wearing school uniforms that were black and white. So even in the naming, there's an affection for young people. Young people continue to have a chief role in going forward from the October outbreak. But so too the history of learning about how to do activism in educational spaces that were very irrelevant to them because they're so privatised and elitist. Yeah? So far from just political opportunity, we're talking about the formation of political subjectivities. We're talking about cognitive practice through alternative spaces as well, and a long-standing tradition in Chile of popular education that mustn't be underestimated. We haven't talked as deeply as I wanted to about Mapuche's territory and struggle. There are 3 main radical organisations. I will make visible these slides so you can track them through if you're interested in particular in that dimension of things. But I think that between the student movements and what had happened with the Penguin Revolution of 2011, the kind of things they did, like outside the Constitutional Hall of Santiago, doing a protest where they reenacted Thriller, that Michael Jackson song, and there were zombies, and they said that this is what the country was doing to education. I mean, very creative, very scene-grabbing, yeah? Performance art as well. And this is way before, yes, TikTok is born kind of there, but it's before it becomes massive, right? And so, yeah, the creativity in the outbreak is really interesting. Of course, there is that kind of note of despondency now and disappointment. And I did have an image to show you as to where things have gone, because I don't want to just be an optimist, because there's still huge political challenges. As I said at the beginning of the semester, social movements are a bit like a spinning top. They keep moving, you don't know where they're going to end. Will it stop? Will it start? Will it go in a different angle? And I think Chile provides an example of that. When all these things were happening, many of us, including those who wrote that first draft of the Constitution, had the largest dreams and hopes possible, and it just seemed to be a culmination of something really big. But where have things gone since? Well, I mentioned Jonathan Cast. I'm trying to find that image though, because my computer's turned itself off. That's not really that conducive. Just look it up online. I'll let you go now. But we have an audio, so if anyone's missed, they can follow up.